Margaret Reed had lived 30 years haunted by a truth she never fully understood. She believed her baby had died at birth and buried her hope along with him. But when a young lawyer fighting illegal adoptions uncovered her name in a sealed investigation, everything she thought she knew started to collapse. Accused of crimes she didn't commit and facing a courtroom that already judged her, Margaret clung to one desperate question. What really happened to her son? Stay until the end, because the truth about Margaret and the boy she lost will break your heart and restore your faith in second chances. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Margaret Reed tightened the worn strap of her purse against her shoulder as she walked through the rusted iron gates of the old cemetery. Her hands trembled slightly, but she ignored the sensation. The gravel crunched under her shoes with every step, a sound she forced herself to disregard as she made her way toward the small, forgotten corner where a solitary headstone bore the inscription, Baby Reed, 1995. Margaret crouched down, brushing away the fallen leaves with the same tenderness one might use to touch a sleeping infant. 30 years, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of time, and still no answers. Her fingers traced the cold letters on the stone, her heart aching as if the wound had been carved just yesterday. She remembered the nurse's pale face, the rushed explanations, the way they had taken her baby without allowing her even a single glimpse. Margaret's throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe. This grave held no body. It was a monument to her grief, and maybe a monument to a lie. In a modest, cluttered office downtown, Daniel McKinley slammed a worn folder onto the conference table, making the scattered group of young professionals around him jolt upright. "We are not talking about isolated mistakes," Daniel said, his voice low but forceful. "We are talking about a network, an organized theft of newborns sold to desperate families with forged paperwork." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. Around the table, faces reflected a mixture of anger and disbelief. Leaning forward, Daniel pulled a photocopy from the file and held it up for everyone to see. A list of names tied to a 1995 investigation that was quietly buried. "We reopen this," he continued. "We find the victims. We expose the ones who profited from the heartbreak of mothers who never even got to say goodbye." His fists clenched as he spoke, the knuckles whitening. He wasn't just speaking as an attorney. He was speaking as someone who believed that injustice left to rot in darkness only festered, and he had no intention of letting that happen. Back in her small kitchen, Margaret filled the kettle and set it on the stove, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. A thick folder sat on the table, untouched. Inside it were letters she had written to the hospital over the years, medical bills and a few photographs of her, holding her swollen belly, all that was left of the short time she had believed she was going to be a mother. The kettle began to whistle, but Margaret didn't move. Her mind had wandered back to the sterile delivery room, the sudden chaos, the way the doctor avoided her eyes, the way the nurse took the bundle away so quickly that she barely glimpsed a tiny hand. Shaking herself free of the memory, Margaret turned off the stove and poured the water, willing her hands to steady. She had lived with this hollow ache for 3 decades, but today something felt different, as if something was about to surface after being buried for far too long. At the courthouse, Daniel adjusted his tie nervously before stepping into the cramped hearing room where the reopening of the investigation would be decided. Rows of wooden benches were occupied by a mix of journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers. The room buzzed with whispers, but Daniel blocked them out, focusing solely on the judge seated behind the towering bench. When called upon, Daniel strode to the front, carrying his thick file of evidence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the quick beat of his heart, "we present overwhelming proof that a series of illegal adoptions were conducted through Crescent General Hospital between 1990 and 1998. We are requesting immediate access to sealed records and the right to contact the families involved." The judge, A grey-haired woman with sharp eyes listened without, interrupting, tapping her pen lightly against the desk. As Daniel continued, he noticed a particular name among the victims listed, Margaret Reed, and something about that name tugged at him, a thread he knew he would have to follow. In the parking lot afterward, Daniel leaned against his car, reviewing the notes scrawled hurriedly across the margins of his documents. His colleague, Sarah, approached, handing him a coffee. "You did good in there," she said, "but you look like you're about to be sick." Daniel gave a dry laugh, accepting the cup with a grateful nod. "It's bigger than I thought," he admitted. "Names, dates, falsified death certificates. It's a house of cards, and it's about to collapse." Sarah leaned in, her voice dropping. "I noticed something while cross-referencing the files," she said. "Margaret Reed, her case doesn't add up. There's no official death certificate for her baby, just a statement from the hospital." Daniel's stomach twisted. "You're sure?" he asked. Sarah nodded grimly. "Positive. If this is real, she might have been mourning a baby who was never even dead." Daniel straightened, a new urgency fueling his steps as he headed back. Inside, they needed to find Margaret Reed. Margaret sat on the worn couch in her living room, the envelope resting heavily in her lap. It had arrived anonymously, with no return address, just her name written in neat block letters. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper. A photocopy of a hospital log entry. Her name was there, along with an unfamiliar note beside it. "Infant transferred." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Transferred. She read the line over and over, her mind rebelling against the implications. Had her baby been alive? Had they taken him away and lied to her? The floor seemed to tilt under her feet as she tried to stand. She gripped the arm of the couch to steady herself, heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time in 30 years, a fragile, dangerous hope flickered to life inside her. Meanwhile, Daniel and Sarah scoured the courthouse archives, combing through musty, dust-coated records. Every document they pulled reinforced the same story. Dozens of mothers listed as having stillbirths, yet no autopsy reports, no burial records, no official death notices. "They covered it up," Sarah muttered, disbelief heavy in her voice. Daniel nodded, jaw tight. "And they used women like Margaret to hide it," he said bitterly. Finding Margaret now wasn't just a procedural step, it was essential. She wasn't just a victim. She might be the key to unraveling the entire operation. The realization made Daniel work faster, sifting through papers and snapping photos with his phone. Somewhere in this mess was the proof they needed, and he intended to find it before anyone else could bury it again. That evening, Margaret sat by the window, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. She cradled the copied hospital document against her chest as if it were something fragile and sacred. The questions swirled in her mind, each more painful than the last. Where had they taken her baby? Was he alive somewhere? Did he know he had been stolen? Her body, worn and tired from decades of sorrow, felt electrified by a desperate need for truth. Margaret stared out into the darkening sky, her decision already made. Tomorrow she would find someone who could help her. Tomorrow she would no longer be the woman who quietly mourned at a grave with no body. Tomorrow she would fight. Margaret struggled to fit a fresh bouquet into the small, chipped vase when the sharp knock at the door startled her. She placed the flowers down carefully, wiping her hands on her apron before crossing the narrow space of her flower shop to open it. A young man in a grey uniform stood there, holding a large envelope with an official seal. "Mrs. Reed?" he asked, glancing down at the paper. Margaret nodded, unease prickling at the back of her neck. Without a word, he thrust the envelope toward her, made her sign a small electronic pad, and left as quickly as he had arrived. Margaret closed the door slowly, her fingers tightening around the envelope as if it might burn her. She returned to the counter, sitting down heavily, and stared at it for several seconds before daring to open it. The first words she read sent her heart racing. "Notice of pending criminal investigation." Her Hands trembled violently as she turned page after page, trying to make sense of the legal jargon. Her name appeared alongside a string of accusations: fraud, conspiracy, illegal adoption practices. Margaret gasped, feeling as though the ground beneath her had given way. How could they think she was involved in something so vile? Daniel dropped another file onto the already teetering stack in front of him, his jaw tightening as he skimmed through the documents. Margaret Reed, he muttered to himself, circling her name on yet another sheet. Former patient at Crescent General. Name appears in multiple transaction logs. Financial anomalies around the same dates. She's connected whether she knew it or not. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, pointing at a highlighted passage. There's no direct proof she accepted money, though. Just circumstantial. Daniel shook his head. It doesn't matter. We have to treat her like any other suspect. If she was complicit, whether willingly or under pressure, she helped these monsters steal children. He grabbed a photo clipped to the latest report. An old, grainy image of Margaret in a hospital gown, eyes swollen from crying, clutching a bundle. The photo never clearly revealed. Look at her, Sarah said hesitantly. She doesn't look like someone who just sold her child. Daniel's voice hardened. Desperation changes people. We can't afford to be naive. He scribbled a note in the margin, subpoena personal records, and moved on to the next file, unaware that the woman he was targeting was tied to him by blood he had never known. Margaret sat at the counter of her flower shop long after closing time, the official papers spread out in front of her, like a battlefield she didn't know how to cross. She reread the accusations, her eyes blurring. With tears, she stubbornly refused to let fall. The words, illegal adoptions, conspiracy, complicity, stung deeper than any wound she had ever suffered. She thought of the life she had built after the loss, modest and solitary, centered around flowers and quiet service to the small community that barely remembered her name. How could they believe she had a hand in stealing babies? Her mind raced back to that hospital room, the hurried explanations, the dismissive nurses. She had trusted them, accepted their word because she had no choice. And now, 3 decades later, that blind faith had turned into a weapon pointed squarely at her. Margaret's fingers gripped the edge of the table as waves of nausea rolled through her. She didn't know how she would prove her innocence. She didn't even know who had accused her. But somewhere out there, someone had decided she was guilty, and the world would believe them before it ever listened to her. At the law office, Daniel sifted through the latest package of evidence that Sarah had collected from the archives. Every piece seemed to reinforce the damning narrative they were building. Transaction logs showing movements of infants, mislabeled as deceased, unaccounted for payments to hospital administrators, missing birth and death certificates. Margaret's name scrawled in hospital memos and listed among administrative irregularities came up again and again. There's a pattern, Daniel said, gesturing to a makeshift timeline they had pinned to the wall. Margaret Reed is not a footnote. She's a key player. Sarah hesitated before responding, her brow furrowed. What if she's a scapegoat? She asked. Daniel turned to her sharply. We can't start second-guessing ourselves now. Too many families lost their children because someone looked the other way. If she's innocent, the investigation will show it. If she's guilty, she needs to face the consequences. He didn't say it out loud, but in his gut, Daniel felt an uncomfortable twinge, an instinct warning him that something about this case wasn't fitting. Together cleanly, yet the evidence was piling up and the wheels of justice were already turning. There was no stopping it now. Margaret spent the next morning in the tiny backroom of her flower shop, calling every lawyer she could find in the phone book, only to be met with cold refusals or exorbitant fees she could never afford. By noon, she sat slumped over the counter, defeated. A few loyal customers came and went, casting curious glances at the papers she hadn't had the energy to hide. One older woman lingered, gently squeezing Margaret's hand in silent solidarity before leaving. With her bouquet, That small gesture nearly broke Margaret's resolve. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her blouse and stared again at the damning documents. She hadn't set foot in Crescent General since the day she had lost her child. Everything about that place was poisoned in her memory, but now it seemed she would have no choice but to return to that nightmare, to dig through records, to find someone who could remember her as more than a name on a list. She refused to let the world paint her as a monster. If she had to fight for the truth, she would, even if it meant ripping open the wounds she had spent a lifetime trying to heal. Inside Daniel's office, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. "We need testimony," Sarah said, flipping through a binder of potential witnesses. "Doctors, nurses, administrative staff, anyone who worked there during that period." Daniel nodded, rubbing his temples. "And we need Margaret Reed under oath." He stared at the picture again. The woman looked tired even back then, fragile yet somehow stubborn. "Set up the subpoena. I want her deposition scheduled by the end of the week." As Sarah left to make the arrangements, Daniel remained seated, drumming his fingers on the desk. His mind drifted briefly to his own history, his adoption, the blank spaces on his birth certificate, the vague answers his adoptive parents had given him. He shook the thought away, focusing instead on the case at hand. Personal feelings had no place here. Justice demanded clarity, not sentimentality. Yet somewhere deep inside, the question gnawed at him. What if we're wrong? What if she's not the villain we think she is? He pushed the doubt down, locking it away behind layers of logic and evidence. Doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. That evening, Margaret pulled out the dusty box she had kept hidden in the back of her closet for years. Inside were relics of a life she had tried to forget. Hospital bills, letters never answered, a single ultrasound photo showing the ghostly outline of a child she had never held. She spread them across the bed, searching desperately for something, anything that might defend her against the accusations she faced. She found an old receipt from the hospital showing payment for services marked emergency intervention and neonatal care, with no mention of a death certificate or funeral. Arrangements. Margaret's breath caught. Could this help? Could it at least cast doubt on the official story? She didn't know. What she did know was that she could no longer stay silent. Margaret gathered every document she could find, tucking them into a battered leather satchel. Tomorrow she would start her own investigation. Tomorrow she would find the strength to walk back into the world that had betrayed her. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his car outside the courthouse, staring at the subpoena already signed and ready to be delivered. His reflection in the window looked tired, older than his years. He wondered just for a moment about the life Margaret Reed had lived all these years. Was she truly capable of the cold cruelty the evidence suggested, or had she been another victim swallowed by a system too vast and corrupt for one person to resist? He shoved the doubts away, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. Justice wasn't about feelings, it was about facts. And the facts said Margaret Reed had to answer for what had happened at Crescent General. As he started the engine and drove away, neither Daniel nor Margaret could have known how deeply their lives were already intertwined, or how the pursuit of truth would shatter everything they thought they knew about their own pasts. "We have an obligation to the victims," Daniel declared, his voice echoing off the walls of the small courthouse auditorium as dozens of people leaned forward in their seats. He gripped the podium tightly, papers spread out in front of him, displaying names and dates that painted a damning picture. This isn't just about uncovering the past. This is about making sure those who betrayed their communities are held accountable. Cameras flashed intermittently from the press section, recording every word for the evening news. Sarah handed Daniel another sheet. Additional names, evidence, damning connections. At the side of the room, several mothers sat clutching framed photos of babies they had lost under suspicious circumstances decades ago. Every eye in the room bore into Daniel with expectation, hungry for justice. He barely noticed the strain tightening in his chest. As he spoke, Margaret Reed's name appeared again on the large screen behind him, projected for all to see, her photo displayed alongside the list of alleged co-conspirators. Daniel didn't allow himself to hesitate. Margaret Reed had become the public face of the scandal, and whether or not he liked it, he knew. The court of public opinion would demand blood long before a judge rendered any verdict. Margaret sat on the cracked vinyl chair of the public defender's office, clutching the battered leather satchel filled with her only proof of innocence. Across the desk, her assigned attorney, a weary woman named Janet Ruiz, flipped through the papers with a growing frown. "They're building a case on you being part of the administration that facilitated the adoptions," Janet said without looking up. "The problem is, we don't have hard evidence to immediately counter it. Your name's in hospital records. But you were a patient, not an employee. Still, in court, perception often outweighs facts." Margaret's mouth went dry as she listened. "I never touched a cent," she whispered. "I never saw my baby." Janet finally met her gaze, her tone softening. "I believe you, but belief doesn't always win. Trials." Margaret gripped the photo of the ultrasound tighter, as if it could somehow speak on her behalf. She had spent so many years trying to forget that day, but now every agonizing detail had come roaring back to the surface. "We'll need witnesses," Janet said. "Anyone who can vouch for you. Anyone who remembers what happened at that hospital." Margaret nodded slowly, a knot of determination forming beneath her fear. She would find someone who remembered. A tinny voice crackled from the old radio on the flower shop counter as Margaret swept the floor absently, lost in thought. Margaret Reed, local business owner named in connection with a decades-old baby trafficking ring. She froze, the broom slipping from her fingers and clattering to the ground. Her knees nearly gave out as she reached for the dial and shut the radio off. But the damage had been done. They said her name on air. Her name, tied forever to unspeakable crimes she had no part in. Customers would hear it, neighbors, old friends she hadn't seen in years. The humiliation burned hotter than any fire. She sagged against the counter, breathing heavily, feeling the walls of her small world closing in around her. She thought of her parents, long dead, and the shame they would have felt. She thought of the baby she had never known and the cruelty of being accused of selling what had been stolen from her. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool surface of the counter, willing herself not to cry. Somewhere, she told herself, there had to be someone who would believe her, someone who could see the truth buried beneath the lies. Daniel paced the conference room floor as reporters bombarded him with questions after the public hearing. Is Margaret Reed cooperating with authorities? One journalist shouted. Will she face criminal charges? Another demanded. Daniel raised his hands to calm them, though inside, unease gnawed at him. The investigation is ongoing, he said, repeating the line they had rehearsed. We have substantial evidence connecting Ms. Reed to systemic abuses at Crescent General Hospital. Our goal is not to vilify individuals without due process, but to uncover the truth. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah caught up to him, a grim expression darkening her features. We might be pushing too hard, she said. Under her breath, the town's already decided she's guilty. If we don't find hard proof soon, this could backfire. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. We can't afford to back off, he muttered. Not yet. Deep down, a part of him recoiled at the thought that they might be wrong, but he buried it beneath the righteousness he had clung to for so long. Justice demanded sacrifices. He only prayed they weren't sacrificing the wrong woman. Late that night, Margaret sat at her tiny kitchen table, the photo of her ultrasound, resting between her palms like a fragile relic. The dim bulb overhead flickered, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Margaret bowed her head, closing her eyes tightly as she began to pray. God, she whispered, voice trembling, I don't understand why this is happening. I only wanted to be a mother. I only wanted to hold my child. Silent tears slid down her cheeks unnoticed. She prayed for strength, for guidance, for a miracle, any small sign that she was not utterly alone in the fight for her name, her dignity, her memories. When she finally opened her eyes, she stared again at the blurred outline of the baby she had never met. That tiny, perfect figure had been stolen from her without mercy. And now, 30 years later, they were trying to steal even the love she still carried. Margaret wiped her face with the sleeve of her blouse, squared her shoulders, and whispered one final prayer: "Help me find the truth." The next morning, Margaret made her way through the crumbling remains of what used to be Crescent General Hospital. The building had been shuttered for years, left to rot like a wound the town preferred to forget. Vines choked the exterior, and broken glass crunched beneath her sensible shoes. She knew she shouldn't be there. There were signs warning against trespassing, but desperation overrode caution. Somewhere inside those ruins lay pieces of her story, pieces she desperately needed to gather before it was too late. As she moved through the darkened corridors, she clutched a small flashlight in one hand and a camera in the other, documenting everything she could find. Faded charts, broken equipment, a torn schedule board still listing names from decades ago. None of it gave her answers, but none of it scared her either. Margaret was beyond fear. She was fighting for her life now, and she refused to let the ghosts of the past defeat her. Meanwhile, Daniel sat reviewing depositions late into the night, his eyes burning from exhaustion. "Another dead end," Sarah said, dropping a file onto the table. "No financial ties between Margaret, Reed, and the hospital administrators. No witnesses who remember her being involved in anything suspicious." Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "But her name keeps coming up," he said stubbornly. "There has to be a reason." Sarah hesitated, then slid another file toward him. "There might be another explanation," she said carefully, "a possibility we haven't considered." Daniel opened the file and scanned the contents, frowning. It was a list of patients whose records had been altered, Margaret's name among them. Altered dates, missing signatures, unexplained transfers. "Someone covered their tracks," Sarah said. "Maybe she wasn't part of it. Maybe she was another victim." Daniel's stomach twisted as the realization took root. If that were true, they weren't just wrong. They were destroying the life of someone who had already lost everything. His hands shook slightly as he closed the file. He needed more proof, one way or the other. Without it, he was about to condemn an innocent woman. Margaret returned home with her camera full of blurry, dusty images and a mind full of doubts. She collapsed onto her couch, exhausted, and pulled the ultrasound photo from her satchel once again. She gazed at it, trying to summon the courage to keep fighting. She thought of the whispers she had heard at the grocery store, the way old friends crossed the street to avoid her now, the looks of pity and judgment that followed her wherever she went. They didn't know her. They didn't know her heart, and yet they judged her based on a few lines of text on a sheet of paper. Margaret ran her fingers over the faint outline of the baby in the photo and made a silent vow. They could call her a criminal, a monster, a liar. It didn't matter. She knew the truth, and she would not stop until the world knew it too. Margaret pressed the battered notebook tighter against her chest as she approached the faded yellow house at the end of the block. The address matched the one she had dug up after hours of scouring old directories at the city archives. She knocked firmly, her heart hammering. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with a deeply lined face and sharp eyes. "Can I help you?" the woman asked cautiously. Margaret swallowed hard, forcing herself to find her voice. "Mrs. Nolan, I'm Margaret Reed. I was told you used to work at Crescent General Hospital. In the maternity ward?" Mrs. Nolan's expression shifted slightly, something between recognition and discomfort. Margaret didn't wait for a refusal. She pulled the ultrasound photo from her pocket and held it up. "Please," she said, voice breaking, "I need answers. They're accusing me of crimes I didn't." in commit, and I think it all started at that hospital. For a long moment, Mrs. Nolan said nothing. Then, with a tired sigh, she stepped aside to let Margaret in. Inside, amid the heavy scent of old furniture, Margaret felt a fragile thread of hope take hold. Maybe, finally, someone would be willing to tell the truth. Daniel flipped through the newly recovered hospital records at his desk, frowning deeper with every page. The birth certificate he had found bore Margaret Reed's name, but the details were riddled with errors. The date of birth didn't match hospital logs. The attending physician listed had been fired months before. The infant's weight and measurements were conspicuously absent. He highlighted each inconsistency page after page, feeling the evidence piling up against her. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said from across the room, studying a similar document. If she was involved, why leave a trail this messy? Daniel leaned back, frustration gnawing at him. Maybe they got sloppy. Maybe they didn't care about covering her tracks because they thought no one would ever look. He stared at Margaret's name, feeling the familiar pang of conflict twist in his gut. Or maybe she was just another pawn, Sarah murmured. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now, not when public pressure was mounting, not when so many families were counting on him to bring closure. He set the documents aside, burying the nagging doubt once again. They needed more evidence, something undeniable. Mrs. Nolan lowered herself into a worn recliner and gestured for Margaret to sit. "I remember you," she said after a pause, studying Margaret's face. "You were so young, scared, alone." Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. Did you see what happened to my baby?" Mrs. Nolan shook her head slowly. "I wasn't in the delivery room, but there were rumors, things we weren't supposed to talk about." Margaret leaned forward urgently. "Please, anything you can tell me." The old nurse hesitated, glancing toward the window as if afraid someone might be listening. "There were babies who disappeared," she said finally, "mostly from mothers who didn't have family or money. Sometimes the paperwork said the baby was stillborn, but no one ever saw the bodies." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. "My baby," she whispered. "They told me he died, but they never showed me." Mrs. Nolan reached out, squeezing Margaret's hand. "I don't know everything, but you were not the only one." The confirmation, even as vague as it was, hit Margaret like a blow. She had lived her entire life mourning a lie, and now the foundations of that grief were crumbling beneath her. Back at the office, Daniel studied an enlarged scan of Margaret's birth certificate, cross-referencing it against old hospital staff rosters. A name jumped out at him, Dr. Ernest Macmillan, the physician listed on Margaret's document, who, according to other records, had been dismissed 6 months prior for misconduct involving falsified patient charts. "Got you," Daniel muttered under his breath, feeling the surge of a breakthrough. He called Sarah over. "Look at this. If Macmillan signed her certificate after being terminated, it means either Margaret was part of a fraud, or someone used his name to legitimize illegal adoptions." Sarah scanned the document, frowning. "Or it means she was set up," she said. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We can't think like that. If we hesitate, we let guilty people walk." But even as he said the words, a small voice inside him whispered that things weren't as simple as he wanted them to be. Still, he ordered Sarah to continue digging into Macmillan's background. They needed testimony, concrete proof, something that would remove all doubt. Without it, they risked condemning a woman who might have already been condemned once. Before, only in silence. Margaret left Mrs. Nolan's house with a slip of paper clutched tightly in her hand, the name and address of another retired nurse who had worked the maternity floor at Crescent General. "She knew more than I did," Mrs. Nolan had said, her voice low with guilt. Determination fueled Margaret's every step as she made her way across town. She knew she couldn't waste any time. The weight of public hatred was growing heavier by the day. She stopped at a coffee shop, pulled out her notebook, and began sketching a timeline. Her pregnancy, the day of the birth, the names, Mrs. Nolan remembered, the oddities in her medical bills. With every note she scribbled, the picture became clearer. Someone had engineered her baby's disappearance, and now, decades later, that crime was being twisted into accusations against her. She couldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could still reclaim the truth. Even if it cost her everything, she had no intention of dying, branded as a criminal for the crime of having once dared to love a child she never met. Daniel's investigation into Dr. Macmillan led him to a grim discovery. A series of settlements paid out quietly by the hospital to avoid lawsuits involving missing or deceased infants. He flipped through legal documents full of redactions and legal jargon, piecing together the sickening pattern. Margaret Reed's name was conspicuously absent from the list of claimants, which instead of reassuring him, unsettled him. More. Why wouldn't she sue if she was part of it? He asked Sarah. Why stay quiet for 30 years? Sarah didn't have an answer. Daniel paced the room, torn between the image he had built of Margaret Reed as a calculating conspirator and the reality of a woman who, by every surviving account, had been nothing but a grieving mother. The contradictions gnawed at him, each piece of evidence forming not a clear picture, but a clouded mirror reflecting too many possibilities. He knew he was getting closer to the truth, but the closer he got, the less certain he became about what the truth really was, and who Margaret Reed truly had been. At sunset, Margaret stood outside the second address Mrs. Nolan had given her, staring up at another worn house, another door she had to knock on. She hesitated only a moment before raising her hand and rapping sharply 3 times. Footsteps sounded inside, and the door creaked open to reveal a woman in her 70s, small and sprightly, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I'm looking for Elaine Carter," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "You found her," the woman replied. "What do you want?" Margaret didn't hesitate. She pulled out her ultrasound photo again, showing it like a badge of honor. "I need to know what happened to my baby," she said, "and I think you can help me." For a long moment, Elaine Carter simply stared at her. Then, wordlessly, she opened the door wider and Margaret stepped inside, crossing another invisible threshold in her long and painful journey toward the truth. Elaine Carter lowered herself heavily into the worn armchair, pointing with a trembling hand to the battered cardboard box sitting on the coffee table. "Everything I know is in there," she said hoarsely. Margaret stepped forward, her heart hammering as she opened the box and began sifting through the yellowed papers and faded photographs. She pulled out a carbon copy of a transfer authorization form, her own name scrawled clumsily beside a signature she didn't recognize. "I never signed this," she whispered, her voice shaking. Elaine's eyes clouded with sorrow. "You were sedated," she said, quietly, "the night you gave birth. You didn't wake up for hours. By the time you did, your baby was already gone." Margaret clutched the paper against her chest, feeling rage and grief surge together inside her. "Why didn't anyone stop it?" she demanded, tears burning behind her eyes. Elaine looked away. "We were warned. Losing our jobs was the least of it. Some people disappeared after asking too many questions." Margaret's knees nearly gave out. Every breath hurt as she realized how thoroughly she had been betrayed. For decades, she had mourned a lie, a theft she had been too powerless to fight. Now she finally had proof, but it came wrapped in bitterness. Daniel dropped his half-finished coffee when he noticed the unmarked envelope slipped under his office door. His pulse quickened as he tore it open, pulling out a single folded sheet of paper. Scrawled across it in hurried, uneven letters was a message that made the room tilt around him. "Not everything is what it seems. Ask about your origin." He stood frozen for several seconds, the words burning into his mind. For his entire life, he had accepted the story his adoptive parents told him. A straightforward, legal adoption. No secrets, no complications. Now everything was in question. He turned the page over, hoping for more, but there was nothing, no signature, no clue who had sent it. He immediately called Sarah, his voice tense. "Get in here, now." When she arrived, he handed her the note. She read it silently, frowning deeply. "Do you think it's connected to Margaret Reed?" she asked. Daniel hesitated, his stomach knotting. Maybe. Or maybe someone's trying to destabilize the case. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this warning was personal, that somehow, without even knowing it, he had been standing at the center of this storm all along. Margaret picked her way carefully through the crumbling hallways of the abandoned Greenville Municipal Hospital. Elaine had told her that many illegal transfers had been coordinated here. Dust and debris littered the floors, but Margaret pressed forward, her flashlight trembling in her grasp. She pushed open the door to an old records room, finding stacks of moldy papers and rusted filing cabinets. She rifled through them desperately, her breath catching when she uncovered a small, unlabeled cassette tape. Without hesitating, she stuffed it into her bag and hurried back to Elaine's house. They found an old cassette player, and Margaret's hands shook as she pressed play. A frail woman's voice filled the room. They sedated the mothers, lied about the deaths, sold the babies to families who could pay. Margaret covered her mouth to muffle a sob. The words were halting, disjointed, but they were undeniable. They confirmed everything Margaret had feared. She hadn't imagined the confusion, the sense of wrongness. She hadn't imagined the loss. Margaret wiped her face roughly and leaned closer, replaying the tape, desperate to catch every name, every date, every detail. This was her chance, maybe her only chance, to piece together the truth and clear her name before it was too late. Sarah appeared at Daniel's office door, carrying a fresh stack of records. "I think I found something," she said without preamble. Daniel motioned her in, his nerves raw. She handed him a file, records related to his own adoption. Daniel flipped through it quickly, then stopped, stunned. The signature for the birth mother was illegible, a crude scribble. Worse, the hospital listed on his adoption forms was Crescent General, the same hospital at the heart of Margaret Reed's case. "This can't be a coincidence," he muttered. Sarah nodded grimly. "I don't think it is." Daniel sat heavily in his chair, the weight of realization crashing down on him. If Margaret Reed was tied to Crescent General, and he had been adopted through the same corrupt institution, then the investigation wasn't just about her anymore. It was about him too, about where he came from, about the identity he thought he understood. He ran his hands through his hair, frustration boiling inside him. "Dig deeper," he ordered. "Find everything you can." As Sarah left, Daniel stared at the crumpled note on his desk. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he was the hunter or the prey. Margaret sat cross-legged on Elaine's living room floor, a spiral notebook balanced on her knees, the cassette player whirring beside her. Every few seconds, she paused the tape, scribbling down names, snippets of dates, half-finished confessions. Images flooded her mind, fragmented memories she had suppressed for so long. She remembered reaching out blindly after the birth, remembered calling out weakly for her child, remembered a nurse's blurred face leaning over her, whispering meaningless comforts, and she remembered the cold emptiness of her arms when she woke up alone. Margaret gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay focused. Every word on the tape was a thread leading back to the truth. It was exhausting, heartbreaking work, but she had no choice. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about reclaiming her dignity, about fighting for the baby who had been stolen from her without mercy. She would find every witness, every shred of evidence. She would not let history bury her alive a second time. Daniel stayed late into the night, poring over old court documents, birth certificates, and hospital records. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he couldn't stop. Every document raised more questions. Why had his adoption been finalized so quickly? Why were there missing signatures, missing witnesses? Why was everything tied back to Crescent General? He reached for the phone to call his parents, but stopped, his hand hovering. What if they didn't know? Worse, what if they did? He dropped the phone, his stomach churning. His whole life, he had believed in the law, in Justice, in truth. Now standing at the edge of a revelation he couldn't yet name, he realized that truth could be weaponized just as easily as lies. Somewhere in the mess of paper and ink was the answer, and when he found it, he would have to decide whether he wanted to know it or whether some truths were better left buried. Margaret scheduled a meeting with another name she had pulled from the tape, Doris Little, a retired nurse now living in an assisted care facility. She dressed carefully, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands before entering the sterile, overlit lobby. A young attendant led her down a narrow hallway to a private room. Inside, a frail woman sat by the window, knitting absently. Margaret approached slowly, holding out the ultrasound photo like a peace offering. "Ms. Little," she said softly, "I'm Margaret Reed. I think you knew me once." The woman's eyes sharpened slightly as she took in Margaret's face, then the photo. "So many years," Doris whispered. Margaret knelt beside her. "Please," she said, desperation thick in her throat, "help me remember what they made me forget." Doris laid a shaking hand over Margaret's and nodded. Margaret squeezed. Her eyes shut for a moment, overwhelmed. This was it, the beginning of the end of her silence. Margaret sat hunched over the battered sewing machine, carefully feeding the faded fabric beneath the needle. She had found the old navy dress tucked away in the back of her closet, untouched for years. Her hands, though worn and trembling from exhaustion, moved with surprising steadiness. Every stitch she made felt like an act of defiance. She couldn't afford new clothes, not with the legal bills piling up, but she refused to walk into that courtroom looking defeated. This dress, patched and repaired with meticulous care, would be her armor. As she worked, she replayed Doris Little's hesitant confession from the night before. The old nurse had finally admitted it. The signatures on Margaret's release forms had been forged. They had used her name, her identity, as a tool for their crimes. Margaret tucked the affidavit Doris had signed into a worn leather folder, along with photocopies of the forged documents. She would not hide. She would stand before them all, before the strangers who judged her, before the son who despised her without knowing the truth, and she would fight. As the last stitch secured the hem, Margaret folded the dress over her arm and stood. Tomorrow, she would walk into that courthouse with her head high, no matter how many stones they hurled at her. Daniel flipped through the thick case file one more time, barely hearing Sarah's voice as she reviewed their notes aloud. He had read these documents 100 times, but tonight the words blurred together. A chaotic mess of accusations, dates, and signatures. His chest burned with frustration. Margaret Reed's name leaped off every page, tied to every inconsistency, every ruined life. His hands clenched around the file. "We can't afford mistakes," he said sharply, interrupting Sarah. Mid-sentence, "We have to make sure she doesn't walk out of there free." Sarah flinched but nodded, gathering the papers into a neat stack. Daniel turned away, pacing the small office like a caged animal. Part of him burned with righteous anger, the part that wanted to see justice done, to give the family's closure, but another part, the quieter voice he tried so hard to ignore, whispered doubts he couldn't silence. What if the evidence wasn't as solid as he believed? What if Margaret Reed wasn't the villain they had painted her to be? Shaking his head violently, he shoved the doubts aside. Tomorrow, he would stand in court and confront her. Tomorrow, he would end this. Margaret stood before the mirror, slipping into the freshly mended navy dress. She brushed her hair back into a low bun and pinned it carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. The reflection that stared back at her was both familiar and foreign. She no longer saw the grieving young mother from 30 years ago, nor the weary flower shop owner. She saw a woman ready for battle. She clipped her folder of evidence into a battered briefcase she had borrowed from a neighbor, slipping Doris's signed affidavit and the photocopies inside. As she checked the contents for the 5th time, a knock echoed at her door. Janet Ruiz, her public defender, stood on the porch, holding a small binder. "You ready?" Janet asked, her voice grim but steady. Margaret nodded once, gathering her things. As they walked toward the waiting car, Janet gave her a sidelong glance. "You know they're expecting you to crumble today," she said. "They think you'll beg or plead for mercy." Margaret straightened her spine. "I'm not begging," she said quietly. "I'm telling the truth." Janet smiled briefly, the first sign of warmth Margaret had seen from her in weeks. "Then let's go give them a story they'll never forget." Daniel arrived at the courthouse an hour early, flanked by Sarah and 2 other members of his legal team. He checked his watch obsessively, running over the planned arguments in his mind. The courtroom had already begun to fill. Journalists jostled for seats, families of victims whispered anxiously, and curious onlookers crowded the back rows. He ignored them all, focusing instead on the heavy stack of files he carried. Today was the day everything came to a head. Today, he would finally get justice. For the families torn apart by Crescent General's corruption. As he set his briefcase down at the prosecution table, he caught a glimpse of Margaret entering the room. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a scuffed leather case, her posture upright, her expression unflinching. Daniel felt a strange jolt, something between anger and an emotion he couldn't name. He quickly looked away, shoving the feeling deep down. Margaret Reed was not the woman she appeared to be. She was a conspirator, a liar. He would prove it. He had to. Margaret's heart hammered as she entered the packed courtroom. Every eye burning into her, she focused on each step, willing herself not to stumble, not to show weakness. She spotted Daniel at the prosecution table, rigid and unsmiling, the very embodiment of righteous fury. For a brief moment, a pang of sorrow pierced her heart. He looked so much like someone she had once known, someone she could almost remember, but she pushed the thought aside. Now was not the time for sentiment. Now was the time for truth. She took her seat beside Janet, clutching the leather case tightly. "Stay calm," Janet whispered. "Follow my lead. Present the affidavit only when they open the floor for your defense." Margaret nodded stiffly, her mouth dry. As the judge entered and the room rose, Margaret closed her eyes briefly, sending up a silent prayer. She didn't pray for victory. She prayed for the strength to endure whatever came next. Whether they believed her or not, she would finally speak the truth aloud, and she would not be silenced again. Daniel's opening statement was sharp, precise, merciless. He outlined the pattern of deceit, the falsified documents, the ruined lives. Every word was crafted to paint Margaret as a willing participant in the hospital's crimes. He pointed to the inconsistencies in her medical records, to the names on the falsified adoption forms, to the payments funneled through anonymous accounts. As he spoke, he didn't allow himself to look at her. He didn't want to see her face, didn't want to risk faltering. When finished, he returned to his seat, breathing heavily. Sarah leaned in, whispering, "You crushed it." Daniel nodded, but the triumph felt hollow. Something gnawed at the edges of his mind, something he couldn't shake. Still, he pushed it aside. He had done his job. Now it was Margaret Reed's turn to face judgment. He steeled himself as Janet rose from her seat, her face calm and unreadable, and called Margaret to the stand. Margaret rose slowly, the worn navy fabric of her dress whispering against the wooden bench. She approached the witness stand with measured steps, refusing to let them see, the fear bubbling inside her. As she took her oath and sat down, she caught Daniel's eye briefly across the room. There was a flash of something there, confusion, doubt, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. Janet guided her through the opening questions smoothly, her background, her connection to Crescent General, her memories of the birth. Margaret answered quietly but firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. Then Janet slid the leather case onto the podium, pulling out the affidavit signed by Doris Little. "Your Honor," Janet said, her voice ringing out clearly, "we submit. This affidavit as evidence that Ms. Reed's signature on the transfer forms was forged, and that she was unconscious at the time her child was taken." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Daniel's face turned a shade paler as he processed the revelation. Margaret clutched the edges of the stand, her chest heaving, but she kept her gaze steady. This was her moment. After 30 years, she had finally found her voice, and she would not be silenced again. The judge rapped her gavel sharply, silencing the rising whispers that filled the courtroom after Janet presented the affidavit. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Given the new evidence introduced today," she said, scanning the room with a piercing gaze, "and considering the gravity of the accusations, I am ordering an immediate genetic test between Margaret Reed and Daniel McKinley to clarify any potential biological connection that may impact these proceedings." The announcement struck like a lightning bolt. Daniel stiffened at the prosecution table, disbelief flashing across his face. Margaret's breath caught painfully in her chest. She gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand, forcing herself not to crumble under the weight of the moment. The court officer approached with the necessary materials, and neither Daniel nor Margaret protested. There was nothing left to do but comply. Margaret extended her arm first, feeling the cold swab scrape the inside of her cheek, her heart pounding with fear and fragile hope. When Daniel stepped forward, he avoided looking at her entirely. His hands shook slightly as he completed the test. Once done, samples were rushed to the lab attached to the courthouse for expedited processing. The entire room seemed to pulse with silent dread as they waited. Minutes dragged into an agonizing hour, every tick of the clock hammering into Daniel's skull. He sat motionless, fists clenched tightly on the table, his mind racing through fragments of memories he had never thought to question. Adoption papers, vague answers, dismissive comments about his unknown background. Sarah sat beside him, her face pale, but she didn't speak. No one did. Across the aisle, Margaret sat like a statue, her knuckles white. Where she gripped the edge of her seat, she did not cry, did not move, barely even breathed. She could feel the outcome drawing nearer, inevitable as a storm she could neither outrun nor prepare for. Deep inside, Margaret knew what the test would show. She had known since the moment she had first seen Daniel, his profile so painfully familiar, even when cloaked in anger. What she did not know was whether he would ever be able to forgive her for a crime she had never committed. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a silent prayer she could barely finish. She was about to lose him all, over again. When the court clerk re-entered the room carrying the sealed envelope, every body stiffened, every breath caught. The judge gestured for the clerk to approach, then slit the envelope open herself, reading quickly. Her brows furrowed, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. Finally, she cleared her throat and spoke, her voice measured but heavy with something none of them had heard before: sorrow. The results confirm a biological match between Margaret Reed and Daniel McKinley. Probability of maternity, 99%. The words fell into the courtroom like stones dropped into a bottomless well. Silence engulfed the space, dense and suffocating. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. His legs wobbled under him. His mind, sharp and logical until that very instant, shattered. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor in front of the prosecution table, the heavy echo of his body hitting the tile, marking the breaking of something far deeper than bone. Margaret rose instinctively but froze midway, her hands trembling violently. She wanted nothing more than to run to him, to gather him in her arms and tell him everything would be all right, even though it wouldn't. Daniel knelt on the floor, gasping, his hands gripping his hair, his whole body racked with confusion, betrayal, anguish. He had spent months, years building a wall of anger, of certainty, and now every brick of it crumbled around him. Margaret Reed wasn't a conspirator, wasn't a villain. She was his mother. The realization cracked open something raw and primal inside him. He looked up at her, his vision blurred by tears he could no longer hold back. Margaret stood frozen near the witness stand, her own face crumpling with overwhelming emotion. There, eyes met across the courtroom, a gaze heavy with 3 decades of pain, of loss, of a bond neither time nor cruelty had managed to sever. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, a guttural sob escaped him, the sound of a man broken by truth. No one in the courtroom moved. Even the journalists lowered their cameras, overcome by the devastation unfolding before them. Margaret's knees gave out, and she dropped heavily into the nearest chair, her hands covering her mouth as she wept silently for the son she had just found, and the years they could never reclaim. The judge, visibly shaken, called for a recess, but no one truly heard her. Margaret rose shakily from her seat, moving as if pulled by an invisible force. She approached Daniel cautiously, terrified of scaring him, terrified he might reject her, but more terrified of not trying. Daniel remained on his knees, his hands hanging limp at his sides, staring at the floor as if trying to find solid ground that no longer existed. Margaret knelt beside him, reaching out slowly, hesitantly, until her trembling fingers brushed against his shoulder. Daniel flinched, the instinct of a wounded man, but he didn't pull away. Margaret let out a broken sob. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice raw. "I didn't know you survived. I would have looked for you. I would have never stopped." Daniel closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the weight of her words, the unbearable truth of them. His chest heaved with the effort to breathe. Every belief he had clung to, every certainty he had wielded like a sword, disintegrated in that single devastating moment. Sarah crouched next to Daniel, whispering something he couldn't hear, but he barely registered her presence. His entire being was locked on. The woman before him, the woman he had dragged into courtrooms, accused mercilessly, vilified in front of strangers. His mother. Margaret wiped her eyes roughly, trying to summon strength she no longer possessed. "I am so sorry," she choked out. "I am so proud of you, and I am so sorry." Daniel's throat closed, preventing any coherent reply. Instead, he leaned forward and, with a broken, desperate movement, wrapped his arms around Margaret. She clutched him to her chest, cradling him the way she had dreamed of doing every day for 30 agonizing years. Tears streamed freely down both their faces as they clung to each other, mother and son, bound now by a truth too profound for words. Around them, the courtroom watched in stunned silence, witnesses to a moment too raw, too human, to interrupt. The bailiffs eventually moved to escort everyone out, but the judge raised a hand, stopping them. She let the scene unfold without interference, understanding better than anyone that justice for once was not in delivering punishment, but in bearing witness to the resurrection of a bond thought lost forever. Margaret held Daniel as if afraid he might vanish again, and Daniel, for the first time in his adult life, allowed himself to be vulnerable, allowed himself to need, allowed himself to grieve, allowed himself to love. Time no longer existed in that courtroom. There was only the painful, beautiful, impossible moment of reunion. And though no verdict had yet been rendered, no legal absolution granted, Margaret and Daniel had found something infinitely more powerful than any gavel's decree. They had found each other. Daniel stood before the crowded courtroom, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might tear through his ribs. The judge had called the session back to order after a long recess, but the proceedings felt different now. Heavy, not with accusation, but with the raw, fragile tension of truth, finally unearthed. Daniel's voice trembled as he rose to his feet, clutching a piece of paper he could barely read through the blur of unshed tears. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it steady, "I ask permission to address the court." The judge nodded solemnly. Daniel turned, facing Margaret directly, the weight of everything he had done pressing hard against his chest. "I accused an innocent woman," he said loud enough for all to hear. "I persecuted my own mother. I let anger blind me to the truth. And I stand here today to say I am sorry." Gasps rippled through the audience, but Daniel didn't flinch. He crossed the room, stopping just in front of her, and dropped to his knees once more, not from collapse this time, but from choice. "Please, Margaret." "Mom, forgive me," he whispered, the last word catching painfully in his throat. Margaret covered her mouth with a trembling hand, overwhelmed by the sight before her. For years, she had dreamed of her child, what he might have looked like, what kind of man he might have become. And now he was kneeling before her, broken, sincere, begging not for mercy, but for love. Slowly, with movements that felt sacred, Margaret reached out and touched his face for the very first time. Her fingertips brushed against his cheek, feeling the slight stubble there, the heat of his skin, the undeniable reality of him. Tears streamed down both their faces, and the courtroom around them blurred into nothingness. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered back. "You were as much a victim as I was." Daniel leaned into her touch, a sob shaking his entire frame. Margaret gathered him into her arms, rocking him gently like the child she had never been allowed to cradle. This time, no one tried to pull them apart. This time, the world bore witness not to their suffering, but to their healing. In the days that followed, Daniel dug deeper into the shadows of his past. What he uncovered left him hollow and enraged. His adoptive father, a man he had trusted all his life, had been complicit in the illegal adoption schemes. Payments had been made under the table, documents falsified, signatures forged. Margaret had not abandoned him. She had been robbed of him. When Daniel confronted his so-called father, the older man didn't even deny it. He simply shrugged, saying it was the way things were done back then. Daniel left the confrontation, feeling sickened and betrayed all over again, but there was no room for hate anymore. He didn't want to be consumed by it, didn't want to perpetuate the cycle of pain. Instead, he returned to Margaret's modest home, the place that had once seemed so small and lonely, now pulsing with the fragile beginnings of hope. He found her outside, tending a scraggly patch of dirt that had once been a garden. Without a word, he picked up a shovel and began to help, their unspoken bond growing stronger with every shared labor. Margaret watched Daniel as he worked, the sun catching in his dark hair, the lines of worry and sorrow softening just a little around his eyes. She felt an ache of gratitude so profound it stole her breath. She had lost so much. Years of motherhood, moments of pride, nights of comfort. But in this single act of rebuilding, she felt a tiny piece of her heart heal. They worked in silence for a long time, pulling weeds, turning the soil, replanting what had withered. When Daniel paused to wipe his forehead, Margaret handed him a cold glass of lemonade, laughing softly when he accepted it with a sheepish smile. It was not the life they should have had. It was not perfect, but it was real and it was theirs. Margaret realized then that love didn't need to be whole to be powerful. It just needed to be true. And Daniel, despite everything, was here. That was enough. One afternoon, as they sifted through boxes of Margaret's old belongings, Daniel found a faded business card tucked between the pages of a book. It read simply, "Reeds, flowers, love grown here." He turned it over in his fingers, feeling a tug deep inside. "You had a flower shop?" he asked, looking up at her. Margaret smiled wistfully. "A long time ago." Before everything, Daniel stared at the card for a moment longer, then looked around at the modest little house they now shared. "We could do it again," he said impulsively. "Rebuild it, together." Margaret's eyes widened, a spark of wonder lighting her tired features. "You'd want that?" Daniel nodded, a smile finally breaking free. "I don't want to lose any more time. I want to build something with you." Margaret pressed her hand over her heart, overwhelmed. She thought she had lost everything worth building for, but Daniel had given her a second chance, and she would not waste it. The next few weeks became a blur of paint, wood, soil, and hope. Together, they cleared out a corner of Margaret's backyard, setting up a small greenhouse and repairing the battered front porch to serve as a makeshift shop. They salvaged old flower pots, repainted faded signs, and planted vibrant new blooms in every corner they could find. Every day brought new laughter, new memories layered carefully over the scars of the past. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Margaret now stopped by with tentative smiles and warm greetings. Some even donated tools or seeds moved by the sight of mother and son reclaiming something beautiful from the wreckage of their lives. Margaret and Daniel worked side by side, not speaking much about the years they had lost, but filling the silence with gestures of forgiveness and love. The flower shop wasn't just a business, it was a resurrection, a statement that life, no matter how broken, could still be breathtakingly beautiful. On the day of the grand reopening, Margaret stood at the entrance of the tiny shop, a fresh Reed's Flowers sign swinging gently above her head. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. A small crowd of friends, neighbors, and even former skeptics gathered to celebrate. Margaret clutched the scissors tightly in her hand, glancing up at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. She snipped the red ribbon with a decisive gesture, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Margaret felt tears burn in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. She turned to Daniel, pulling him into a fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding your way back to me." Daniel hugged her tighter. "Thank you," he whispered back, "for never giving up." They stood there for a long moment, two broken souls stitched back together by something stronger than blood. Love, tested by time, betrayal and loss, but ultimately triumphant. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the last rays of sunlight faded, Margaret and Daniel sat side by side on the porch, their hands stained with soil, their hearts light. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, and Daniel covered her hand with his own. They watched the flowers sway gently in the breeze, each bloom a testament to survival, to hope, to forgiveness. Margaret closed her eyes, savoring the simple, perfect peace of a moment. She knew there would still be hard days ahead, still be wounds that needed time to heal. But she also knew that she and Daniel had been given something rare, a second beginning. Together, they would honor it. Together, they would grow. We put a lot of heart and dedication into creating stories like this for you. Every video is made with great care, thinking about bringing meaningful moments to your life. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep bringing more special stories your way. Take a moment to explore the other videos we prepared with so much affection, and share with us in the comments, what did this story mean to you? Your interaction is very important to all of us. Thank you for being part of our family, and we'll see you in the next video.